So, many of you know that I've debated fat and carbohydrates a lot over the years, but I've ignored protein because protein intake, it's pretty static, yeah? And aren't we all just generally having enough protein? So why should we be concerned? We all know that carbohydrate is the only macronutrient that directly impacts on blood glucose levels. So this is where the chocolate cake comes in, and chocolate cake is full of flour and sugar and it digests to glucose and impacts on blood glucose levels. But recently people have been asking me, but Trudi, what is the indirect impact of protein foods on blood glucose levels? Are they like chocolate cake? So hopefully throughout this presentation, we'll address that in more detail. So the learning outcomes. Why dietary protein is essential, good sources and minimum daily protein requirement to prevent diseases of deficiency. Protein involvement with appetite control and weight management. The benefit of consuming sufficient protein and what sufficient looks like, and what gluconeogenesis is and how protein can impact on blood glucose levels and also hormone levels of insulin and glucagon. Do I have any conflicts of interest? Well, I'm founder of the charity Expert Health, and we provide self-management education to help develop the knowledge, understanding and confidence for people to make informed decisions, and that's something we've talked about in detail already this morning. So we're governed by the Charity Commission, and fortunately we don't accept any funds from the food or pharmaceutical industry. So why is dietary protein essential? It got its name from a Swedish chemist right back in 1838. And it's derived from the Greek word for primary, which means standing in front. So even back then, it was recognised that protein is absolutely vital for survival. After water, it's the most abundant compound in the body. And in the protein in the body, about 43% of it is in our muscle, 16% in the blood and 15% in the skin. So it's everywhere in our body. Protein contains 4 calories per gram, and a lot of protein-rich foods are essential kind of contributors to micronutrients such as, meat is a good source of selenium and iron and zinc, and dairy products for calcium and iodine. People think of proteins as mainly being to do with muscle and bone, and yes, these are, kind of essential functions of protein, so they help support the body, tissue repair and growth, but there's other functions as well. So hemoglobin carries essential nutrients around and molecules around in the blood. We need protein to make hormones such as insulin. We need protein to make enzymes that digest our food. We need it for a healthy immune system, so protein is essential for this. And we also need protein for our genes, for our gene expression. So proteins are constantly being built and degraded. So we call this protein turnover. There's 20 amino acids, so the building blocks of protein are amino acids. 9 of these amino acids are essential. And when we say essential, it means that we have to eat them because the body can't make them. 6 amino acids are what we call conditionally non-essential. They become essential if protein intake is insufficient or at times of stress or illness. And the remaining 5 amino acids are non-essential, which means that we can make them in the body. We talked quite a lot about serotonin yesterday, and tryptophan is an essential amino acid that's required to make the neurotransmitter serotonin. If we're deficient in serotonin, then that can cause lethargy and depression. And serotonin is needed to develop the precursor of melatonin. Melatonin is needed for good quality sleep. So a deficiency in tryptophan could also lead to insomnia and poor sleep. So that's just an example of how important just one amino acid can be. So to consider how important protein is, we need to look at the guidelines. How much do we need to eat? And when we look at the guidelines, the UK reference intakes and the World International recommendations recommend between 45 and 50 grams of protein per day, which is probably less than 10% of our energy intake. So it's not a lot really. And that's why people often say, well, we're having too much protein, we're exceeding that. But it's important to note that this is the minimum requirement needed to maintain bodily function and avoid deficiency. So how many people actually know that when they look at the guidance and the guidelines and see the 45 grams a day or 50 grams a day, how many people think that's what they should be having and they shouldn't be having more? But there's a lot of evidence to support that actually we should be having about double of that. We should be having about between 1.2 grams to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight for optimum health and well-being. And why is this? Well, we know in healthy ageing we need protein to prevent the muscle wasting and the reduced strength that we often see in older people. Falls over the age of 75 are one of the leading causes of mortality in older people. And by people having a sufficient protein, we can help to prevent that. Protein also increases satiety, so it reduces the appetite. And that's really important in weight control. And also in weight control, protein helps to reduce the fat mass and increase the lean body mass, the protein mass, the muscle mass that help to achieve and maintain a healthy weight. And we know that protein is required in athletic performance as well. So how much protein are people having? So when we look at the UK National Diet and Nutrition surveys, we see that people are having around 16 to 17% of their calories from protein. So that's probably why I've ignored it for many years, thinking, yeah, people are having enough protein. And when we look at the absolute amount, we can see that females are having on average around 67 grams a day and men around 85 grams a day. So they're exceeding that minimum requirement. But then you look at how many calories people are reporting they're having. And women are reporting to having just over 1,500 calories a day and men just over 2,000 calories a day. Now, putting the limitations of calories in and calories out aside, if people were having this energy deficit of 1,500 calories, 2,000 calories a day, you would expect to see some weight loss over time and certainly not weight increase. But what are we seeing? We are seeing a weight increase. So here you can see that in adults, around a third of adults are obese, around a third or over a third, 40% of adults are overweight, and only around a quarter of adults are actually in the healthy weight zone. So there's some kind of disconnect about the calories that people are reporting having and the weight of the nation. And why could this be? And where are those extra calories coming from? So the behavioural insights team looked into this in more detail, and they found there was underreporting. So what they did is they measured energy expenditure using the gold standard doubly labelled water, and they could see that people were underreporting their energy intake by around 30 to 50%. Which totalled up to about extra 1,000 calories a day. So rather than the females reporting 1,500 calories, they were probably having around 2,500, and men around 3,000 calories a day. So where do you think these excess calories were coming from? And it's probably no surprise that people tend to remember what they have in their main meal of the day, but they may forget the drinks and the snacks in between. And the drinks and the snacks in between tend to be the ultra-processed foods, which are high in carbs and fats and low in protein. So the protein that they were reporting to have is probably quite accurate, but the excess calories are likely to come from the additional fats and carbs. So when we said earlier on that people were reporting having around 16 to 70% of their calories from protein, that then drops to about 11%. Now, if you're interested in this subject, I recommend that you read the book Eat Like the Animals. It's a fascinating book, and when I was reading it, then they described, the authors, the researchers described a study that they did, one of the earliest human studies looking at protein leverage, and they published this in 2003. And the book referred to this study, so I sourced the paper and read it in detail. And this paper looked at individuals that had a Swiss chalet, and they got volunteers in this Swiss chalet. And the first couple of days, they gave people food and said, just eat what you want. And they calculated what these individuals were eating. And then in days 3 and 4, they randomised these individuals into 2 groups. One group could only eat high protein foods, and the other group were given low protein foods that were high in carbohydrates and fat. They could eat as much as they wanted, but they had to stick to the foods that they're being allocated. And what did they find? They found that the individuals in the low protein group actually increased their calorie intake by 35%. The individuals in the high protein group reduced their calorie intake by 38%. And they did that because the absolute amount of protein they were eating stayed the same in days 3 and 4 as they were in days 1 and 2. So the message is there, they were keeping their protein constant, but eating until they met their protein requirements. And that is what protein leverage is. And so this is an example here of if somebody was having around 14% of their calories from, where's this thing here? 14% of their calories from protein, and then they kind of adopted an ultra-processed food diet, and their protein percent of the calories dropped to 12.5, they would need to eat 14% more to get sufficient protein. So I kind of started questioning this, and I thought, okay then, if someone's on a 15% protein diet and consuming 2,000 calories, and then they started to adopt an ultra-processed food diet, and their protein percent in their total calories for the day dropped to 10%, then they dropped their protein by 25 grams. So when they were having 15% of their calories from protein, they were having 75 grams of protein. When they started to consume ultra-processed foods that dropped their percentage of calories down to 10%, they were only getting 50 grams of protein. So their body would stimulate hunger to carry on eating until they achieved that 25 grams of protein to obtain their requirements. And that would result in them eating an additional 1,000 calories a day, which is increasing their calorie intake by 50%. And so the protein leverage is being shown and it's being proven, but the hypothesis is that's the thing that's driving the obesity pandemic. That's the hypothesis. So to look at this further, we've got here some grilled chicken. People decide what to eat. So if someone ate a quarter of a pack, which is 121 grams of grilled chicken, they'd be getting 191 calories and around 26 grams of protein. Then if they ate pizza, to get a similar amount of protein, they'd have to have 3 times the amount of calories to get that same amount of protein. So people decide what to eat, and then the body then decides how much they're going to eat of that food. So our hunger will continue until our protein requirement has been met. And so this is another demonstration that people who have a very low protein diet are likely to have a greater energy intake, whereas when protein intake goes up, then the energy intake tends to come down. So I've already mentioned the protein levelers hypothesis, that eating ultra-processed foods that are high in carbs and fat, low in protein, is probably driving the obesity pandemic. Because protein's role in weight management, we know it reduces appetite, we know it increases feelings of fullness. We know that around 20 to 30% of the actual calories in protein are taken up to release the energy from it. So we call this the thermal effect of food. And that's greater than the thermal effect of food for carbohydrates or fats. And so when people are on a weight loss diet, they're less likely, by having a high protein diet, less likely to regain weight. And it's because it helps to build the lean body mass, and the lean body mass is more metabolically active than the fat mass. It helps to maintain metabolic rate and protect muscle wasting. So back to this study here that actually recommends that we should increase our protein intake to between 1.2 or to at least 1.2 to 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight. So here we go with the slide I showed earlier. This would equate to around 100 grams, 120 grams of protein a day for a male and 100 grams of protein a day for a female. So how do we calculate protein requirements? So a 60-gram woman, then if she was going to have 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight, she'd have about 72 grams of protein a day, on up to 96. So up to about 100 grams a day. And this is a calculation for a 74-kilogram man. And that's how you'd work out your protein requirement. And so this would, an example, general rule of thumb is to try and obtain a minimum of 30 grams of protein at a meal. And so a 4-egg omelette with some cheese in could give you around 38 grams of protein, 140 grams of halloumi with some yogurt salsa would give you about 33 grams of protein, and a 220 gram steak could give you around 49 or 50 grams of protein. So that gives you a rough idea. The Keto Fitness Club have got some fantastic infographics showing how much protein there is per 100 grams of food. This shows that it's quite easy when you're looking at eggs, because then a large egg is 7.5 grams. So you think, 4-egg omelette, that's 30 grams. That's easy to calculate. But people often ask me, well, Trudi, these are the kind of how many grams per 100 grams, but how do I what's the calculation to get my 30 grams of protein? And so an example here is that raw chicken, 24 grams of protein per 100 grams. So if you wanted to get 13 grams of protein from your chicken, then the calculation is here. You'd have to eat 125 grams of chicken. But that's the raw weight. So if you're weighing the chicken when it's raw, it's 125 grams. But what's the weight if it's cooked? So when you cook meat and fish, then the weight drops. So cooked meat and fish is about 75% of the raw weight. So then you do the calculation, so you times the 125 grams by 0.75 and you'd eat 94 grams of cooked chicken to get your 30 grams of protein. So we talked about the quantity of protein, but what about quality? Does that matter? And a more recent assessment of quality of protein is the DIAS, the Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score. It's a lot easier to say DIAS. And so we're talking about essential amino acids here. So it's the ability of the food to provide all the essential amino acids in the correct quantity to meet human needs. And I looked at this study here that assessed different plant foods and animal foods to see what the DIAS, the quality score, was. So it's interesting here, you've got all the plant ones, and the plant proteins tend to have a limiting amino acids, so amino acids that they're short of, and so they have then a lower DIAS score. So if the DIAS score is below 75, then it's not complete protein, it's a no quality claim. If the score is between 75 and 99, it's classed as a high quality protein, and if the score is above 100, it's classed as an excellent quality protein. So there's no surprise here that the excellent quality proteins tend to be the animal products. And the only one that's over 100 that's not an animal product is a potato, and we'll move on to that one next. So there's also, though, this score changes depending on age. So babies up to 6 months old, the score is a lot lower because their digestive tracts aren't as mature, and so the only protein that they have a higher score for is the casein, which obviously we get from the milk, and so that's the only one that is classed as a good one, and it's the red line here. So this is babies below 6 months. The yellow line is babies from 6 months up to 3 years, and you can see that they have a lower DIAS score because they can't digest the same amount of protein as adults can and older children. And then the grey line is the humans above 3 years old. So the potato had quite a good score. So would that lead us to think that we could eat potato to get all the protein that we need? And this is when I think we need an assessment, a bit like we do with carbohydrates. Glycemic load in carbohydrates recognises both the quantity and the quality of the carbohydrate. And we need to perhaps look at that for protein, because potatoes look really good on that previous slide because they had a DIAS score, good quality, excellent DIAS score of 100. But how much protein do we get from potatoes? Not a lot. So to get just 8 grams of protein from your potatoes, boiled potatoes, you'd have to eat 520 grams, which then would give you 77 grams of carbohydrate and 354 calories. So if we compare that to 3 eggs, the 3 eggs will give us 23 grams of protein, no carbohydrates, and only 236 calories. So what about a pork steak? Then we can get 200 gram or 8-ounce pork steak. We can get 44 grams of protein, no carbohydrate, and 294 grams calories. So I think diet on its own is rather misleading, and we need to also assess the quantity of protein required as well. So moving on now, when you're kind of talking to people about protein, they often come up with, but isn't protein harmful for us? Will it damage my kidneys? Is it harmful for people with diabetes? Let's look in gluconeogenesis now. So what is the term gluconeogenesis? What it means is making of glucose. So at rest, our body, our liver can chuck out 144 grams of glucose over a 24-hour period. So that's not even, it can chuck out more than a low carbohydrate diet. But in exercise, if it's required, our liver can produce 600 grams of glucose over a 24-hour period. For every 100 grams of protein we eat, we can make 56 grams of glucose if we have to. And that's why carbohydrates are not an essential nutrient, because if we don't eat carbohydrate, we can make the glucose instead. So should we be concerned about protein foods? So these are how different foods impact on blood glucose levels. And if it's got a blue dot, it's either a beverage or a carbohydrate food. If it's a purple dot, it's snacks. So the ones here, just by having a quick look, you can see that the foods that greatly impact on blood glucose levels the most are the beverages, the carbs, and the snacks. The red foods are the high protein foods, and they're right at the bottom of this chart here. So we can see that the protein foods are not impacting on blood glucose levels a lot in healthy individuals. And it's Camden was talking about homeostasis, thank you. And that's how we control blood glucose levels. And so when we eat protein, then the pancreas produces glucagon, which tells the liver to release glucose into the blood. The rise in blood glucose levels then tells the pancreas to produce the insulin that then helps to clear the glucose out of the blood. So the glucagon and the insulin work in perfect harmony in healthy individuals. However, in diabetes, where there's either a lack of insulin or there's insulin resistance, then glucagon can dominate. So there's no longer that perfect harmony and homeostasis. Instead, the glucagon dominates. And so when glucagon dominates, what does it do? You have a rise in blood glucose levels. So here we go. So I get patients on a low carb diet. They're not cheating. They haven't got the carb creep. And they come back and say, but Trudi, why are my blood glucose levels high? And it's probably down to the gluconeogenesis. Their liver has still got a high level of insulin resistance, so their glucagon is dominating. So then they say, should I avoid protein foods? Should I reduce my protein intake? My answer is no. Let's deal with the root cause. And we talked about root causes yesterday, and Steve had his fantastic slide on insulin resistance, and that's the root cause. So avoiding protein will just lead to an increased appetite and reduced metabolic rate. Increasing protein in the diet tends to help to reduce overall energy intake, helps to reduce fat mass, and how does that impact insulin resistance? It helps that key, the insulin, to fit the lock better to helps to reduce the insulin resistance. So when people go on a low carbohydrate diet and they're still getting hyperglycemia, I say stick with it. Your liver needs to mend. Your liver needs to heal. Eat sufficient, good quality protein. But then they say, but isn't protein bad for my kidneys? You know, so any leftover amino acids, the liver break it down to ammonia, the ammonia is converted into urea, and our kidneys are a filter. So we keep the good stuff in the blood, and the waste, the urea, comes out in the urine. So if we eat higher protein amount, isn't that extra hard work for the kidneys? And are the kidneys going to get exhausted? Well, fortunately, to answer that question, work has been done. So this paper here looked at the changes in renal function between individuals having a high protein diet and individuals having a low protein diet. And they found no evidence that high protein intake would decline renal function in healthy individuals and even in individuals with type 2 diabetes. And they said this is a really important point because we recognise the importance of protein in our diets to healthy ageing and reducing, preventing the loss of muscle mass. But then people say, well, there's evidence that diabetes causes nephropathy. It's a complication of diabetes. It's all about protein. But we've known since the UK PDS study published in 1998 that damage to the filtering process in the kidneys, allowing protein to leak out in the urine, is down to high blood glucose levels and high blood pressure. So it's down to hyperglycemia and hypertension. That's what causes the damage to the filtering processes in the kidneys, not the protein. Just because we see protein in the urine doesn't mean it's protein's fault. And then David's study here, he's actually looked at this. He's recognised that patients who go on a low carbohydrate diet tend to increase their dietary protein, but also shown that after an average of 13 months, then there was no deterioration in renal function. In fact, the biochemistry actually improved. And indeed, we've got a Cochrane systematic review, so that's classed as the gold standard, where they've looked at all the research where people with diabetic kidney disease have been treated with a low protein diet. And is that effective? There's been no evidence. So when you look at a Cochrane systematic review and you see that the summary is on the 0 line there, that shows that there's absolutely no evidence that a low protein diet to treat diabetic kidney disease is effective. But what we do know, and this is another systematic review and meta-analysis, what we do know that dietary protein at levels above the current recommendations are effective at preventing hip fractures and are effective at increasing the bone mass density. So, in summary, consuming sufficient protein is important for many essential functions in the body. Not consuming enough quality protein can cause people to overeat fat and carbohydrates. Protein quality is dependent on the ability of the diet to provide all the essential amino acids. Protein will be converted into glucose when glucagon levels are raised. But in insulin-resistant conditions, then we need to treat the root cause, and patients shouldn't avoid eating sufficient protein. So a good rule of thumb is to eat at least 30 grams of protein per meal, more if you're having fewer meals a day. So the reference nutrient intakes are minimum amounts, and improvements in health are seen with around double that amount. There's no strong evidence that protein can harm the kidneys, and there's no evidence that low protein diets can improve kidney function. But there is strong evidence that high protein diets may prevent fractures and improve bone mass density. So, for optimum health, can you have your cake and eat it? I'd say no, but you can have your steak and eat it. Thank you very much.